By midnight, our HOA had financed the street, sent private security to patrol our homes, and turn neighbors against each other. And it all started with one email on New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve on our street usually felt calm, almost boring, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. The houses were lined up neatly, lawns trimmed to perfection, and holiday lights blinked politely instead of flashing wildly. By the afternoon of December 31st, most families were already preparing for small celebrations inside their homes. Music hummed softly behind closed doors, and the smell of food drifted through the cold air. At that moment, it felt like another peaceful year was ending quietly. I stood near my living room window, watching neighbors come and go. Jake Miller was struggling to untangle a string of lights on his porch, already visibly annoyed. Across the street, Mrs. Evelyn Evans carefully adjusted a small wreath on her door, moving slowly but deliberately. Everything looked normal, too normal. I didn't know it then, but this would be the last time our street ever felt that way. Because by the time the night ended, our neighborhood would never be the same. Around 4 in the evening, my phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again and again. A notification from the HOA group email popped up, followed by several message alerts. That alone was unusual. The HOA rarely contacted us on holidays, especially not on New Year's Eve. Curious, I opened the email. The subject line read, "Important, immediate HOA policy updates effective tonight." That single word, immediate, made my stomach tighten. The email was long. Way too long for a holiday announcement. It outlined new enforcement rules, parking restrictions, noise limits, and fines that would be applied starting at midnight. Midnight. On New Year's Eve, according to the message, any violation, loud music, extra guests, cars parked incorrectly, would result in instant fines. No warnings. No grace period. I reread it twice, hoping I misunderstood. But the message was clear, cold, and final. At the bottom was the familiar signature, Harold Benson, HOA President. Within minutes, the neighborhood group chat exploded. What is this nonsense? They can't do this tonight. Is this even legal? Jake was the first one outside. I watched him storm across his driveway, phone in hand, waving his arm angrily. Sarah followed him, trying to calm him down, but he brushed her off. Soon, other neighbors stepped outside too, standing on their porches, phones glowing in the dim light. People weren't yelling yet, but you could feel something shifting. A quiet tension settled over the street, heavier than the winter air. Mrs. Evans walked over to me slowly, holding a printed copy of the email. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from anger. "This isn't right," she said quietly. "They've never enforced rules like this before." Before I could respond, another notification arrived. This time it was a follow-up email, shorter, sharper. "Failure to comply will result in penalties. Security will be monitoring the area tonight." Security. That word sent a ripple through the crowd. People looked around, as if expecting guards to appear out of nowhere. A few neighbors laughed nervously, brushing it off as a bluff. Others didn't laugh at all. As dusk settled in, the festive lights felt different. What once looked cheerful now felt watchful. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Conversations grew hushed. Doors closed more quickly than usual. One by one, neighbors retreated indoors, unsure of what would happen next. I checked the clock. 8:17 p.m., 4 hours until midnight. 4 hours until the new rules took effect. I had a strange feeling, the kind you get right before a storm, that this wasn't just about noise or parking. This felt planned, calculated, like someone wanted to start the new year by reminding us who really had control. And as I closed my curtains and turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the thought that the countdown to midnight wasn't just welcoming a new year. It was counting down to something much worse. The first fine arrived before midnight. That was the moment I knew the HOA wasn't bluffing. At 9:42 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't an email, it was a notification from the HOA payment portal. Someone on Oak Ridge Lane had been fined for excessive noise. No name was listed, but everyone knew exactly who it was. Jake. His garage door was open, and music spilled faintly into the street, not loud, not wild, just enough to feel festive. Jake stormed out onto his driveway, holding his phone up like evidence in a courtroom. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted. "It's not even 10 o'clock. Sarah followed him, her voice low and urgent, trying to pull him back inside. but the damage was already done. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Curtains shifted. Faces appeared behind windows. The street felt awake in a way it never had before. Minutes later, a dark SUV rolled slowly down the road. No markings, no flashing lights. Just a vehicle moving far too slowly to be normal. It paused briefly near Jake's house before continuing on. Nobody spoke, but everyone noticed. The message was clear: we're watching. The group chat lit up again. They're already patrolling. This feels illegal. Someone needs to stand up to them. That someone, unfortunately, was Jake. He marched straight toward Mr. Benson's house at the end of the street. I watched from my porch as he knocked. Hard. The door opened only a crack. Benson didn't step outside. He didn't have to. His voice carried easily through the cold air. The rules were clearly stated, Benson said calmly. Compliance is expected. Jake laughed bitterly. On New Year's Eve? You're out of your mind. Benson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Take it up at the meeting, he replied, and closed the door. That was when the lines were drawn. By 10:30, the street felt divided. Some neighbors turned off their lights and sat in silence, terrified of fines. Others quietly pushed back, closing doors harder than necessary, letting music play just loud enough to feel defiant. Every small sound felt dangerous now. Every laugh, every footstep, every car door. Mrs. Evans knocked on my door later that night. She looked unsettled, more serious than I'd ever seen her. I'd been reviewing old HOA records, she said. Something doesn't add up. She explained that the board had quietly updated enforcement authority weeks earlier, without a proper vote. Emergency powers, increased fines, private security. All approved during closed sessions. Legal on paper maybe, but deeply unethical. Benson has been waiting for a moment like this, she said. A moment when emotions run high. Outside, fireworks popped faintly in the distance from another neighborhood. A reminder of what New Year's Eve was supposed to feel like. On our street there was no joy, just tension. Just waiting. At 11:15 p.m., another fine hit the system. Then another. People started accusing each other. Who reported us? Was it you? Someone's feeding them information. Trust evaporated in minutes. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years suddenly felt like strangers. Every closed door felt suspicious. Every dark window felt like an accusation. Then, just before midnight, a final email arrived. Emergency HOA meeting. Tomorrow. Attendance mandatory. No location listed. No time specified. Just one final line at the bottom. Non-attendance may result in penalties. As midnight struck, there were no cheers on our street, no countdown, no celebrations, just silence. And the unsettling realization that whatever was coming next was going to be much worse than a fine. The morning after New Year's Eve didn't feel like the start of a new year. It felt like the aftermath of something heavy, something unfinished. The street was quiet but not peaceful. Doors stayed shut longer than usual. Cars left without friendly waves. People avoided eye contact, as if even looking at each other might invite trouble. I stepped outside just after 9. The cold air bit harder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. Jake's garage was open again, but this time there was no music. He stood inside, staring at his phone, jaw clenched. Sarah sat on the front steps, arms wrapped around herself. They hadn't slept. None of us had. By mid-morning, the fines were still coming. Emails arrived one after another, parking violations, trash bin placement, unauthorized decorations. Things that had been ignored for years were suddenly urgent problems. It didn't feel random, it felt targeted. And slowly, the street began to realize that the HOA didn't need to punish everyone. It just needed to punish enough people to scare the rest. That's when the accusations started. At the end of the block, Mark Reynolds confronted one of the newer residents. Every time someone gets fined, you're the first to close your blinds, he said. That's not a coincidence. Voices rose, neighbors gathered. Someone accused someone else of reporting violations to avoid fines themselves. Another claimed the HOA was offering leniency to informants. No proof, just fear feeding on itself. Mrs. Evans tried to calm people down, reminding them we were neighbors, not enemies. But her voice was drowned out by frustration that had been building for years, rising costs, ignored complaints, rules that changed without warning. The New Year chaos hadn't created these feelings, it had just exposed them. That afternoon, a printed notice appeared taped to every mailbox. Emergency HOA meeting tonight 7 p.m. Community Hall, attendance mandatory. No explanation. No agenda. Just a command. By evening, the community hall was packed. People stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering angrily. The mood was hostile, electric. When the HOA board finally walked in, Benson in front, flanked by Linda Parker and Tom Wilkins, the room went silent. Benson smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that told you he knew something you didn't. He opened by reminding everyone of their obligations and community standards. He spoke calmly, confidently, as if the chaos outside those walls didn't exist. When someone shouted from the back, Benson raised a hand, and the room fell quiet again. Then Tom spoke. "Let's be clear," he said. "Some of you have been violating rules for years. The board simply decided it was time to enforce them." That's when Jake stood up. "You didn't enforce anything," he snapped. "You ambushed us." The room erupted. People shouted. Accusations flew. Someone demanded to know who approved private security. Someone else demanded financial records. Linda Parker avoided eye contact, shuffling papers nervously. And then Benson dropped the threat. "Continued disruption," he said evenly, "may result in legal action." Silence returned, thick and suffocating. That's when Mrs. Evans stood. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply held up a folder. "I think everyone deserves to see this," she said. Benson's smile vanished. Inside that folder were HOA documents, meeting minutes, emails, budget reports, proof of closed-door decisions. Proof that the board had planned the New Year enforcement weeks in advance, anticipating backlash, even preparing fines as leverage. The room buzzed with shock. Benson tried to regain control, but it was too late. The trust was broken. The damage was done. As people filed out of the hall, no one celebrated a new year anymore. We all understood one thing clearly now. This wasn't just an HOA problem. This was a war over control, and it was far from over. The morning after the emergency meeting felt heavier than all the days before it combined. Whatever illusions people had left about compromise or reason were gone. The HOA board hadn't backed down. If anything, they'd tightened their grip. By noon, the first retaliation arrived. A certified letter sat in my mailbox, stamped with the HOA seal. Inside was a formal warning citing behavior inconsistent with community harmony. No specific violation. No explanation. Just a reminder that further incidents could lead to fines or legal review. I wasn't alone. As I walked down the street, I saw neighbors opening identical envelopes, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. Jake got hit harder. 2 violations. One for verbal harassment at the meeting. Another for ongoing non-compliance. The total fine was more than his monthly mortgage payment. Sarah burst into tears when she saw the amount. Jake didn't yell this time. He just stared at the paper, jaw locked, like someone calculating how far they were willing to be pushed. The security SUV returned that afternoon. It parked at the entrance of the street and stayed there, engine running. Windows dark, it didn't move for hours. Kids who normally played outside stayed indoors. Dogs barked nervously. Every time someone stepped onto their porch, the vehicle's engine revved slightly, just enough to be noticed. Fear works best when it doesn't have to speak. Inside our homes, conversations changed. People whispered. Phones were muted. Group chats went silent. The sense of community that once defined our street had been replaced by caution and paranoia. No one wanted to be the next example. Mrs. Evans stopped by again that evening. She looked tired but determined. "They're isolating us," she said. "If we don't push back together, they'll pick us off one by one." She believed Benson wanted people to fold quietly, pay the fines, stop asking questions, fall in line. And for some, it was already working. A few neighbors publicly apologized in the group chat, promising full compliance. Others removed decorations, canceled gatherings, even returned unopened holiday gifts just to avoid attention. But not everyone was willing to surrender. That night, someone leaked the HOA documents Mrs. Evans had shown at the meeting. Screenshots appeared online. Emails surfaced showing Benson discussing strategic enforcement and behavior correction. The story spread faster than anyone expected. And Benson noticed. Another email arrived late that night. Unauthorized sharing of HOA materials constitutes a serious violation. An internal investigation is underway. People panicked. Who leaked it? Who would be punished? Trust eroded even further. Some neighbors began pointing fingers. Others deleted messages, afraid of being implicated. Jake knocked on my door just before midnight. He looked exhausted, eyes bloodshot. "They want me to be the example," he said quietly. "I can feel it." He wasn't wrong. The next morning, a towing notice was slapped onto his car windshield. No explanation. Just a threat. That was the moment something shifted. This wasn't about order anymore. This wasn't about rules. This was about dominance, about reminding us that our homes weren't really ours not as long as the HOA held power. And standing on my porch, watching the SUV idle at the end of the street, I realized something terrifying. The board wasn't trying to calm the neighborhood. They were trying to break it. The change didn't happen loudly. There were no speeches, no public defiance. It started quietly, the way real resistance usually does, in whispers, in late-night texts, in brief conversations held just a little too close to front doors. It began with Mrs. Evans. She slipped handwritten notes into a few mailboxes, careful not to be seen. Simple messages, no names, no accusations. Just a time and a place. Sunday evening. Garage 12. Nothing more. Somehow everyone who needed to understand did. I arrived just after sunset. The garage door was only half open, casting a narrow strip of light onto the driveway. Inside, about a dozen neighbors stood in uneasy silence. Faces I'd known for years now looked different, tired, angry, determined. Jake was there, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Sarah stood beside him, nervous but resolute. Even Mark Reynolds had shown up, eyes scanning constantly, as if expecting someone to be watching. Mrs. Evans waited until the door was fully closed before speaking. "They want us divided," she said calmly. "That's the only way this works." She laid out what she had been gathering, not just HOA documents, but patterns, selective enforcement, targeted fines, financial discrepancies, security contracts approved without resident consent. The New Year chaos wasn't spontaneous. It was a stress test. They wanted to see how much pressure we could take, she continued, and how fast we'd turn on each other. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Jake clenched his fists. They chose the wrong test subject. The plan wasn't reckless. No shouting, no confrontations. Just documentation, recording interactions, saving emails, photographing violations, not to report neighbors, but to prove inconsistency. If the HOA was going to play by the rulebook, so would we. For the first time in days, the fear loosened its grip. But resistance never stays hidden for long. The very next morning, Benson sent out another message. Unapproved gatherings are a violation of community policy. No names. No proof. Just a warning. The security SUV returned that afternoon, circling the block twice before parking directly across from Garage 12. The message was obvious. "We know where you were." That should have stopped us. Instead, it confirmed everything Mrs. Evans had said. Neighbors who had stayed silent before started speaking up. Emails flooded the HOA inbox. Polite, professional, relentless. Requests for records. Questions about budgets. Demands for explanations. Every message was copied, saved, documented. And Benson snapped. At the end of the week, another notice appeared. This one bold, aggressive, and unmistakable. Mandatory full community meeting, attendance required. This time there were consequences listed, heavy ones. People were scared again, but something had changed. Fear no longer stood alone, it had been joined by anger. By resolve. As I watched neighbors walk back into their homes that night, heads high, I realized we had crossed a line. There was no going back to silence, and whatever Benson planned for that meeting, he was about to lose control of it. The community hall smelled of stale coffee, anxious sweat, and tension so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Residents had arrived early, more out of necessity than willingness, their faces tight with frustration. Everyone knew what tonight was. The mandatory meeting Benson had threatened in his latest email. But unlike before, this time, something had changed. The neighbors weren't going to sit quietly. Jake paced near the back, muttering under his breath. Sarah tried to calm him, but he barely listened. Mrs. Evans stood near the podium, quietly holding the folder that contained weeks of evidence against the HOA. Everyone around her glanced nervously at her, but also with a sense of hope. If someone could stand up to Benson, it was her. The doors opened and the board filed in. Benson first, confident, upright, and smiling. Linda Parker and Tom Wilkins followed. Their smiles, sharp and controlled, faltered slightly when they saw the crowd. Something was different. The residents weren't trembling. They weren't whispering. They weren't isolated. They were united. Benson began with his usual formal tone. Thank you all for attending. As you know, compliance is essential for the harmony of this community. His words fell flat. Every sentence was met with murmurs, with whispered comments, with eyes rolling. He tried to continue, but the air had shifted. Fear no longer led the room. Jake snapped first. This is ridiculous, he shouted. You've been targeting us, picking favorites, threatening us, and now you want us to sit here like obedient children? Others joined. Voices rose, overlapping, some shouting, some pleading. Accusations flew across the room. Who approved private security? Why are fines applied unfairly? Where's the transparency you promised? Benson raised his hand, attempting control. Enough! Order is... Order? Mrs. Evans interrupted. She stepped forward, placing the folder on the podium. You call this order? Look at this! She opened it, and documents were passed along the front rows. Residents leaned in, murmuring and gasping. Meeting minutes, emails, budgets, all proof of manipulation, selective enforcement, and secrecy. Every resident now had the same proof Benson had tried to hide. The room erupted. People yelled, some pacing, some pointing. Jake slammed his fists on a table. Others shouted over each other. The board tried to interject, but no one was listening. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with tension. The carefully constructed image of control the board had maintained for months collapsed in minutes. And then it happened. A younger neighbor, frustrated beyond reason, accidentally knocked over a chair. The crash echoed, startling everyone. Someone laughed nervously. Another shouted. A group at the back began chanting, "We want the truth! We want the truth!" Benson's calm demeanor cracked. He raised his voice more forcefully than anyone had ever heard. This meeting will proceed as scheduled. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted entirely. The board no longer led the room. The residents controlled it. Evidence in hand, voices raised, unity in action. The HOA could no longer intimidate or silence anyone. Their authority, built on fear and manipulation, was collapsing. By the time the meeting adjourned, hours later, no resolutions had been reached. But something significant had happened. The neighborhood had realized its strength. They had seen the cracks in the board's power. They had discovered that even the most controlling HOA couldn't suppress a community once it refused to be divided. Outside, as people walked home, faces lit by streetlights and winter's cold, the quiet that usually followed these meetings felt different. There was no fear. There was no submission. Just exhaustion and a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this New Year's Eve hadn't been about destruction. It had been about awakening. The following morning, the neighborhood felt different. Silence still hung over the street, but it wasn't the heavy, fearful silence from before. This was a tense, waiting silence, like the calm before a storm. Everyone knew the board had overplayed its hand, and now it was only a matter of time before the fallout began. By mid-morning, Mrs. Evans had quietly copied all the evidence from her folder, meeting minutes, emails, fines records, security contracts, and distributed them to every household. Screenshots, printouts, and even digital copies appeared in group chats. The information was unmissable. Every resident could see it, read it, and understand the truth. The board had not enforced rules to maintain harmony. They had manipulated, threatened, and controlled for power. Benson called another emergency meeting, insisting it was urgent, but this time it was different. Residents arrived, but instead of fear, they carried documents, questions, and determination. Jake, Sarah, Mark, and a dozen others filed into the hall together, forming an unspoken alliance. Mrs. Evans placed her folder at the front, letting it rest on the podium like a weapon of truth. Benson opened his mouth to speak, but the room erupted before he could. "How could you do this to us?" Jake shouted. "You've lied to us for months," another resident yelled. "Who approved these fines?" Someone else demanded. Benson raised his hands, trying to regain control. Order. "I will not," but no one listened. Documents were passed row by row. People compared notes. They read out loud from emails showing selective enforcement, security surveillance, and fines meant to intimidate specific neighbors. The room was alive with voices, accusations, and revelations. Every lie, every hidden action, every manipulation the board had tried to cover was exposed in plain sight. Linda Parker and Tom Wilkins fumbled through papers, faces pale. Their authority crumbled as residents demanded explanations. Every defense they tried to offer was drowned out by proof and outrage. The board had thought fear would keep them in control. But now, the neighborhood had unity, and unity was far stronger than fear. Then Mrs. Evans spoke, her voice calm but firm. This isn't just about fines or rules. This is about trust. You violated that trust. You can't take it back. You can't intimidate us anymore. A hush fell over the room. Benson's smile, once confident and sharp, was gone. He looked around at the people he had tried to control and realized something terrifying. They were no longer afraid. They were angry. They were united. By the time the meeting ended, the board's grip on the neighborhood was shattered. Some residents had already contacted legal advisors, planning action. Others openly vowed to remove Benson and his allies from the board. The street, once fractured and fearful, now buzzed with resolve. As I walked home that evening, the winter sky glowing faintly with the last traces of daylight, I looked at my neighbors differently. There had been chaos, anger, fear, but there had also been courage, unity, and the determination to stand up for what was right. For the first time in weeks, hope returned to the street. But there was also a lesson, heavy and clear. When those in power abuse their authority, it only takes courage and truth to dismantle it, piece by piece, person by person. And that new year, meant to celebrate a fresh start, had truly marked the beginning of something far more significant. The awakening of a neighborhood that would never again let fear control it. The days after the final meeting felt surreal. The street that had been buzzing with tension and conflict was quieter now, but it wasn't calm. The fear that Benson once used to control everyone was gone, but something else lingered, a cautious awareness, a fragile sense of victory. People had won, but at a cost. Trust, once broken, doesn't return overnight. Benson never openly retaliated after the evidence was exposed, but his influence was gone. Linda Parker resigned quietly, and Tom Wilkins avoided the street entirely. It was as if the board itself had evaporated, leaving the neighborhood to pick up the pieces. Yet the street didn't feel the same. Friendships strained during the chaos hadn't fully recovered. Some neighbors who had turned on each other in fear were still hesitant to speak, still unsure if trust could be rebuilt. Jake and Sarah, exhausted but relieved, spent hours repairing their home. Decorations, lights, even the small trimmings that had been removed in fear of fines. Their efforts weren't just about beauty. They were about reclaiming normalcy. Other neighbors followed suit, slowly breathing life back into the street, decorating again, opening windows, speaking to one another. But everyone did so cautiously, knowing that peace had been fought for and must be maintained. Mrs. Evans became a quiet hero in the neighborhood. She organized meetings, but this time they were informal, inclusive, and transparent. Residents learned to communicate directly, not through fear or authority. She reminded everyone of what had happened, the mistakes of the HOA board, and the power each person had when united. The lesson was simple: silence and fear were tools of control. Awareness and courage were tools of freedom. I often walked the street alone in the evenings, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The snow had melted, leaving bare lawns and footprints of the night's chaos. Children played outside again, their laughter timid at first, but growing louder each day. Dogs barked, neighbors greeted one another, and the street slowly regained the rhythm of life, but no one forgot what had happened. As I turned the corner to my own house, I realized something important. This neighborhood had changed forever. We had learned to stand up against manipulation, to question authority, and to protect one another. But even with the HOA dismantled, there was an uneasy awareness that some battles are never truly over, some scars remain. Some lessons must be remembered every day. That new year had started with chaos, manipulation, and fear. It had ended with exposure, courage, and a hard-earned sense of control. The street would never be the same, but perhaps that was for the best. Sometimes change comes wrapped in conflict. Sometimes it comes quietly after silence breaks. But even after the HOA lost its grip, something never fully returned. Trust. The rules changed. The fines stopped. The security SUV disappeared, but the silence it left behind felt different, heavier. Because now we knew something we couldn't unknow. That control doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as community standards. And every time a new email notification pops up on my phone, I still pause, because I remember how it all started. With one message. On New Year's Eve, the faint hum of distant fireworks reminded me, life goes on. But this time, the neighborhood would face it together, wiser, stronger, and unafraid. If this happened in your neighborhood, would you stay quiet, or would you fight back?